it if you have to pull the ripcord and leave part of the way through. So that's a mouthful. Paving the way to re-engagement and maximization of client value. So in our businesses, there's a spectrum of services that we provide, right? And in some businesses, it can start from something very naturally, like a small priced item, and then naturally go up all the way to something larger. So if you think about, if you're one of those businesses that has an item that is only a large ticket item, you're thinking of someone like a real estate agent or something like that, there's still room to create a spectrum of service that leads up from a small transaction, which may be a transaction of time and attention, all the way up to a full relationship. So as we're going along, we'll talk a little about maybe some of the practical ways we can tackle that idea. And I'm not watching the clock, so if someone can kind of tell me how we're doing for time, that'd be good. Anybody else? All right, thanks, Mark. So that's what the value ladder is in your business. So you can call it a value ladder, you can call it a spectrum of service if you want. But the reason why we're thinking about the spectrum of service is because in a lot of businesses, there's an over-focus on one part of that spectrum, or maybe two parts, but they don't see it as a continuity. You know what I mean? So an example of this might be someone who has a large ticket item that they sell, perhaps at a car dealership, and they can't get their minds away from around the idea that there is a relationship that needs to be built over time. And it needs to be done with a series of touch points. And we know in sales that people don't usually purchase on the first bounce unless there's some dire need. If your house is on fire and you need a fire extinguisher, you're probably going to purchase it with a great deal of urgency. But the rest of the time, people are in kind of research mode. It's also true that if you're in a business where there is a large number of SKUs or combinations of products, you might start out with someone coming in and purchasing something small or trying a loss leader. We see grocery stores do this very effectively. Or someone might come in and do a price comparison, one of these price matching deals, just to try you out, just to see what it's like. And that's one of those transactions at the small end of the spectrum. And that's one of the things that we can use or be conscious of that kind of leads into larger transactions. We spend a lot of energy on customer acquisition. Anyone will tell you that that's probably one of the most expensive parts of our marketing. And when we start thinking about our service offering as a spectrum of services, we can start thinking about that customer who's already been acquired and maximize their value by gently educating them about what else is in our spectrum of service. So you may have someone who responded to an ad or an offer, and now they're a customer. And you know who they are, and they know who you are, but they don't know everything about what you can do, or they don't know what other things are possible. And perhaps you haven't had the chance to do a full discovery with them if you're in a service business. In marketing, we try to do very deep discoveries so that we can find out what else, what's next. We have the example of Walt Disney, the Walt Disney Corporation. They were always asking the question, what else, what next? And their spectrum, we're all familiar with this, starts with what? What do you think their spectrum of service starts with? Anybody? What's that?
Cartoons. The old cartoons.
Yeah, it starts, you started way sooner than I thought you would. I thought someone would fall into the trap of saying the parks. But it's true. Your awareness of and consumption of Disney services started when we were all kids. they've been working on us for years, right? So it started with that very small bit of attention. That's what we paid as consumers, and for the cost of having to endure some breakfast cereal commercials, we were able to get entertained. And so there was that transaction. We paid some attention, and they provided some free entertainment. And so Disney has taken this to the nth degree. They've actually taken it all the way up to the point where they're servicing corporate clients about how to service their clients. They've written books about it. They have an excellent book, forget the name of it right now, but it's I think it's At Your Service, something like that. Have you read that? Yep. And it talks all about creating experiences for your clients. So, but in between that spectrum, where you have the corporate at the one end and the kid in front of the television watching Mickey Mouse for free, there's a lot of other things. And they're always asking, what's next and what else? To give you an example of one of the things that was counterintuitive, if we were on the outside of the thought process, they looked at their parks and they said, well, we have all these people who are willing to walk through the gates at Disney World and experience the park and eat food. I wonder if we could get them to sleep here. Someone asked that question. And they thought about it, and they built the Disney hotels. And it turns out people are very much willing to sleep there. And that doesn't change the cost of the park, maybe if there's a package, but now their customers have been moved into a different part of this potential spectrum here. And once they asked that question, they said, well, if they're willing to sleep here, would they be willing to buy a timeshare here? Would they be willing to buy a little chunk of this in a kind of a permanent, formal way? And turns out people were willing to do that too. And while they were at it, they asked, would people be willing to have this whole experience on a boat? And, well, we all know the answer to that too. People were willing to do that as well. Because of all of the things they had done up into and leading up into the parks and the timeshares and the hotels and the cruise ships, the decision was already made in the minds of the consumers. We love what you're laying down over here. And so the answer is probably going to be yes. If you imagine something that I am already familiar with and put your own spin on it, I think the answer will be yes, because I'd like to see your take on that. And so there's a version of that can take place in our businesses. And maybe we've had the experience of watching a customer go to a competitor, and the competitor is offering them something that we could have offered, but because we're a little bit nervous about bothering the person or re-engaging with them, somehow the customer gets away from us. And for the want of a phone call, or maybe sending out a little needs survey, or doing a little extra discovery, or perhaps an experiment to see whether or not they would be interested in our concept of what else or what's next, for the want of that, the customer goes somewhere else because they don't have any specific attachment to us. They don't see us as something more than a commodity provider. And that's dangerous, because as soon as we become only a commodity provider to a customer, suddenly we're extremely replaceable. And the kicking tires, the price comparison, all of these things are symptoms of our customers thinking about us as a commodity, something they can get anywhere. So, just see here. So we talked a little bit the last time I was here about social media and creating content that creates a frictionless sale. And when we're talking about free content, it makes us uncomfortable sometimes, putting ourselves out there and talking about everything that it is that we do, how we do it differently, presenting our personalities to a prospect. But it is transactional, just like the little kid sitting in front of the television. It has an effect. and people will respond to and notice our personalities. Maybe they feel a little more inclined to call. They might resonate with our personalities, ideally. Or you might say something that unlocks something in their minds, and now they can't unsee what you've said. You've transformed them from someone who didn't realize something was possible. And so when you create possibilities for people, you now have a permanent place in their imagination. You've transformed them as a person. The person you were before you stepped onto an airplane for the first time is a completely different person than the person who got off that airplane afterwards. You are now a person who has flown. And you can explain that to other people who have flown, and they'll understand it. But this is the power of these low-priced or zero-priced transactions that we can put out there. We talked about that a little bit last time, but the mechanics are super important. Yes?
Can I ask you a question about that before I forget?
Yes.
How often do you have to make that touch of offering something to your clients? They really think that's appropriate.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So we're all in different businesses that have different consumption cycles, right? So there's nobody here from a funeral home, right? That's a very long consumption cycle, right? And we don't like to think about that, but you want to be on people's minds at the time they require your service, right? In other situations, like a grocery store, the consumption cycle is very short. So ideally, you'll notice that in businesses where there are short consumption cycles, the advertising cycle is also very short. Whereas with other businesses, like real estate agents, they have no idea where the consumption cycle is. It's invisible. So they're constantly maintaining a high level of awareness for the client. So there's no answer other than to say it needs to match with the consumption cycle of the prospect. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
So we don't know when people are going to need life insurance next, necessarily, but we know that at some point they're going to reevaluate. And there's certain things that we want them to believe about us so that we are the most logical option out there. In some industries, like insurance, like the financial services industry, things are the things you can say about your product without getting into trouble. It's a highly regulated industries. So what we say about our product is very limited, and it changes constantly. And you don't want to end up with a huge body of videos on YouTube, for instance, or messages on Twitter or whatever, and then find out that you have to purge a third of them because your industry has changed the way that it's regulating your marketing messages. So one thing that you can do, and at the same time keeping yourself extremely interesting, is think about what complementary characteristics your ideal prospect has, and then speak to those. So if you are a person who is in real estate specializing in farm and greenbelt properties, I have a friend of mine out in Caledon who does this, he has to be very careful about how he talks about properties, but he knows that of the three customer segments he's talking to, one of them is farmers who are retiring soon, and one of them is property investment people who are looking for properties to invest in and then maybe subsequently sell to builders. And he's also interested in builders. And so just taking the one example of the farmer, what other things does that farmer want to learn about or discover or understand better that may have very little to do with real estate per se, but has a lot to do with where he is in his life? Maybe how to pick a retirement home, I don't know. You'd really have to sit down and think about it. Maybe even talk to talk to those clients. Ask them, where they're at, ask probing questions, and then try to provide that. This is especially helpful if you are in a business like the example from the beginning, the funeral home. Now, how do you market that? You don't want to be too on the nose. In fact, you may want to avoid the whole subject altogether. It's enough that you have the business name on your card and maybe something that you're putting out there about the community. You've done a series of videos about getting to know your community. Perhaps you donate to the local women's group. Different things you can do to maintain awareness of what you do and show your commitment to the community rather than even addressing the subject whatsoever. So what I'm saying is that your product and your message, that spectrum of service can start with something that doesn't even appear recognizable as part of your service. And it might not be intuitive because we're hyper-focused on our craft and on the way that we're delivering our service. So sometimes it's hard for us to step back and think about the broader needs of that ideal client group and then think of how we can add kind of an onboarding, increasing level of value, spectrum of service leading up to us as the absolute logical provider of that final service in this case. But I mean, a lot of us are in businesses like that. With real estate, it's a large transaction. You're not selling them. Well, maybe you are. Maybe you're not selling them a series of increasingly large buildings, leading up to an empty lot leading up to a mansion. It doesn't always work that way, but you can become an educational resource, talking about other things that they care about, which may or may not include things about real estate. I don't sit around reading about real estate all the time or ever. I glance at the pages before it goes into the wood stove. But I will tell you that, and she's not here so we can talk about her, Diane Giberson, she's, how do you pronounce your last name? Giberson, okay. She is fantastic at this. I mentioned her last time. It's because you can't turn around without seeing something that Diane is up to. And it's not about real estate for her. It's about community. So what she has brilliantly done is she's looked at the ideal customer group and said, okay, well, over here somewhere in the near future, I don't know, now, 6 months from now, 6 years from now, this group is going to want to buy or sell a home. And my whole mission in life is maintaining their awareness of me. And she's never loud, and she's never on the nose, but she's also never missing. She's always doing something. She brought us seeds one day with her business card stapled to them. Nice little gesture. And I showed it to my wife, and she was excited and planted them somewhere. I don't know. But these are the kinds of things you can do when you think about your message as part of a spectrum of service leading up to your services. You may be in the enviable position of being able to look at your business and say, we do this, and we can also provide this what's next or what else type of service. And it's a good idea to look at your business in that continuity. The other thing that we should really talk about, and it's extremely important, is the cost of re-engagement after your initial customer acquisition. And that's what we're talking about with maximization of client value as well. Whenever someone becomes a customer, or you do even the smallest little transaction for you, you should have control over your ability to re-engage with them. I call that we call your mailing list or your engagement list in broad terms a lead bucket. Tactically, it might be all of your subscribers on YouTube. The next time you put a video on YouTube, they're all going to get notified either gently, or if they click the little bell, they'll get something loud. But you can re-engage with them now that you have the initial cost of acquisition out of the way. You can re-engage with them at basically no cost. And that's the enviable position to be in. So that's one lead bucket, the YouTube. Of course, Twitter is just a lead bucket. So you don't get wrapped up in thinking, should I be on YouTube? Should I be on Facebook? Should I be on Pinterest? Think about them as what they are. They're opportunities to re-engage with people. And if you can re-engage with them in a meaningful way and at no extra cost, then they are performing the service that they're designed to perform. The only problem with most lead buckets is that you don't have any control over your list, and that's why ultimately the gold standard for lead buckets and for re-engagement is to have someone's email address on a list. Because Facebook might change its rules, and all of a sudden they don't like what you're laying down. It could be that it just doesn't become effective anymore, or maybe your Google Plus account gets shut down for some ridiculous reason. So that's a resource you suddenly don't have any control over, and this asset in your business that you're able to re-engage with has vanished. So we should also always be actively trying to move people from whatever lead bucket we have them in right now. Maybe it's just our customer database even, in QuickBooks or whatever you're using, but moving them from there into some place where they can be engaged with at no additional cost, because that's where you're going to get the biggest bang for your advertising dollar. What often happens is we spend money on an ad, and then people come through the door and spend a bunch of money on us, and then we start all over again. And it costs us the same, our customer acquisition cost. It's being wasted because we're not re-engaging with people at no cost. A friend of mine who runs a successful carpet cleaning business, this was one of the simplest suggestions that I gave him, because he has a busy season and he just wanted to fill in some of the areas between his busy seasons. We don't have carpets at home, so I don't know what those are, but let's pretend that they're in March, in the spring, or leading up to the spring, up till May, and then in the months leading up to Christmas. So if he is actively capturing email addresses, he can provide offers in the off times to level out his income. And because he has those contacts already, and he already has a relationship with that person, he's much more likely to convert that person in his lead bucket into another sale. So in his case, the spectrum of service is not over the size of the transaction, but over the year. He's just trying to fill in all the little spaces. So we're just about done?
Well, that's 1 o'clock, but feel free
Okay.
to
All right. Does anyone have
carry
any?
on and finish off.
If anyone has to take off, that's fine. Are there any questions so far about any of that? Heidi?
So if, in terms of the mode of delivery, do you find that physical, the old-fashioned mail delivery is a better source of reconnecting with some of your clients? I mean, in my business, some of the clients are older, so that would be ideal for them. But for email newsletters or Facebook, like, do you find that there's a certain, you guys look at analytics as far as what sort of response you're getting to the different things that you're trying? Have you seen sort of any patterns or trends as far as what works best?
Whatever rises out of the noise, really, right? If you find that sending a paper newsletter to a key demographic in your ideal customer base is getting high open rate, and that's working, if that test works, then continue to do that. Even try different things. Read up on direct mail. There's some great things you can do with direct mail thinking. It really comes down to what each and every case. We know that younger people may be more inclined to consume consume information on YouTube, whereas, you just say, a piece of paper sent through the mail is still highly effective. You might even try making it lumpy. Go to the dollar store and get a bag full of something that goes with your message. There was whenever I receive mail from Amsterdam Printing, I think they're in Cornwall, I bought a bunch of pens from them, and they send me a lumpy envelope about once a month. And I pick it up, and there's something in there, and I get excited. And I open it up, it's a free sample. But the open rate for Amsterdam Printing, for me, is 100%. And when I'm ready to buy pens, they're the only people I'm thinking about.